Well, hello. All right. So yeah, welcome to this installment. So this is the Edgar Allan Poe, You Never Knew, We Never Knew. And especially Edgar Allan Poe, he's more than a lot of other English-speaking poets, he's managed to maintain a certain presence among popular culture and everything. He's relatively, accessible, even just like everybody kind of knows Poe, right? Even if they're not into literature, because he just shows up in all sorts of different situations, which is not necessarily good, right? There's this popular image of Poe, which is kind of cartoonish and plays into a lot of the, I think, problems in our culture today. This death cult, right? This kind of obsession with self-destructive behavior and just really, just the insanity, right? So there's a kinship there in Poe with the perceived image of Poe and the popular image. So I think in large part that shows that there's been a loss of ability to appreciate the profundity of Poe. And it's really only superficial. And the reason for that is because Poe was very profound. He spoke a lot in his works, as we're going to see. We're going to be looking at the poetry. So we're going to be investigating Poe's mind through the poetry, which means looking at pieces as well that are not so popular, right? That go outside of just the mainstream thing that people are used to. And I think it's important today, because the culture really has been emptied out. People don't have a relationship with history. They don't really have a relationship with the sublime. The emotions are pretty limited that we encounter if we're just going through the system, through the education system, experiencing popular entertainment and all that. So I think it's important to study Poe because he really is a sublime figure in history. And there's a lot that can be opened up. And especially the fact that Poe is a poet. Poetry has a unique power of kind of opening up the soul and stirring something in people that they just don't experience in day-to-day life, that they don't experience in our education system in the Western world, or perhaps anywhere in the world. You have to look for it. You have to seek it out. But when you do, you find out that every human being actually has that capacity. So in this respect, it's a great discovery to really get into Poe's work and see what he's trying to do. And so let's just start by, this is what Poe says. At the end of his life, he toured. He was giving lectures. And one of the lectures he was giving is on the poetic principle. So he was going around talking about this. What is poetry? Wherein lies the poetry in something? Because there was always, as today, there's a lot of wannabes and a lot of false ideas of what poetry is, which have a lot to do with the way people think, the way people perceive the nature of human beings. It limits their ability to interpret certain qualities, certain ideas. So can somebody read this for me? This is from the Poetic Principle.
You should probably read it so that it catches on the recording device.
Okay. I'll be reciting a lot. That's the only reason I wanted to. So he writes, an immortal instinct deep within the spirit of man is thus plainly a sense of the beautiful. This it is which ministers to his delight in the manifold forms and sounds and odors and sentiments amid which he exists. And just as the lily is repeated in the lake, or the eyes of Amaryllis in the mirror, so is the mere oral or written repetition of these forms and sounds and colors and odors and sentiments a duplicate source of delight. But this mere repetition is not poetry. He who shall simply sing with however glowing enthusiasm, or with however vivid a truth of description of the sights and sounds and odors and colors and sentiments which greet him in common with all mankind, he, I say, has yet failed to prove his divine title. There is still a something in the distance which he has been unable to attain. We have still a thirst unquenchable to allay which he has not shown us the crystal springs. This thirst belongs to the immortality of man. So this is what Poe thinks, right? If you think about this kind of morbid image of Poe that we have in popular culture, this kind of macabre, haunting, tormented figure, this doesn't really match up. Not quite. There may be similarities, right? He's speaking because he's talking about the immortality of man. And so the question of mortality becomes quite prevalent. But the issue is not mortality. It's the immortality. So how is Poe going to get at this? And especially today, right, in the 20th century, where you really had something really nasty come up with, it takes many different forms. Matt touched on this in the other presentation about the Congress of Vienna. But in the 20th century, you had something called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And you had this idea of the culture wars, where the guy that I want to talk about is this philosopher, German philosopher named Theodor Adorno. And think about this. This is a very kind of, this is a big question, because in the 20th century we had World War II. We had the Holocaust. We had Hiroshima, right? This showed us what human beings were capable of, the evil and darkness, right, in the soul of man. And so somebody like Adorno, he said that writing poetry after the Holocaust is barbaric, right? This idea that, and it's often debated what he really meant about that, but this idea that we would pursue beauty, right, and pursue all these lofty ideas, right? How could somebody write the Ninth Symphony, the Ode to Joy, or paint the Mona Lisa after the Holocaust? This was a serious question in art, in thinking. I was listening to a podcast, and it was about this contemporary piece called Who's Afraid of Red, White, and Yellow, I believe. And it was this whole thing where the question for the painters after World War II was, what can we paint? What can we do? We can't just pretend this hasn't happened. And so I think it's important to, in this context, pose the question, okay, sure, human beings are capable of all sorts of different things. But what happens when this thirst that Poe is talking about, what happens if our society loses this thirst, right? Because he says poetry uniquely is the thing that summons this within us. It kindles this yearning, right? All great art does. All great art, from ancient Greece, the Renaissance, the Islamic Renaissance, great Chinese painting, all of this, it kindles something within us. And there's examples throughout history. So what happens when we lose this thirst? Whereas Adorno says, now basically, and as we've seen in the 20th century, we have to start portraying the evil of man, right? We have to get into the complexities, right? We can't avoid this anymore. And the question becomes, okay, so art is going to become a vehicle for mirroring all this evil that man does, but is surrounding ourselves and our society, our culture, with images of evil and ugliness? Is that really how we're going to decrease the level of evil and ugliness? Is that really a good way to do it? So, here's what Poe says now specifically from two of his pieces on the question of poetry and music specifically, because we're going to compare with what Adorno says to get a sense of the battle, which is still ongoing today, between these different ideas of art, which are really based on our idea of human nature. So Poe says, that pleasure which is at once the most intense, the most elevating, and the most pure is, I believe, found in the contemplation of the beautiful. When indeed men speak of beauty, they mean precisely not a quality, as is supposed, but an effect. They refer, in short, just to that intense and pure elevation of soul. And then this is from the philosophy of composition, which we're going to look at more, which is talking about how he composed the Raven. And then from the Poetic Principle, he says, "And thus when by poetry, or when by music, the most entrancing of the poetic moods, we find ourselves melted into tears, not as the Abate Gravia supposes, through excess of pleasure, but through a certain petulant, impatient sorrow at our inability to grasp now, wholly, here on earth, at once and forever, those divine and rapturous joys, of which through the poem or through the music we attain to but brief and indeterminate glimpses. The struggle to apprehend supernal loveliness, this struggle, on the part of souls fittingly constituted, has given to the world all that which it, the world, has ever been enabled at once to understand and to feel as poetic." So this struggle to apprehend the supernal loveliness is how he states it. I think that's very provocative, right? So there's this innate yearning that we find in great art that we really find nowhere else. Or rather than say that, perhaps I should say Poe, like all great artists, he understood that if the population was not in a disposition to receive beautiful ideas, lofty ideals in the realms of the arts, they could never pursue them in the real world. And so art, and Schiller says this, it's art, it's keeper bee. With you it falls, with you it will be risen. Right? So art is really this sacred fount, the preserver of our society, of our freedom, of our humanity. What does Adorno say? He speaks specifically on music, but as we see, and which is pretty obvious, right? The relationship between poetry and music, all forms of art, there's a kinship there. So the principle applies, regardless of if it's expressed slightly differently. But music and poetry have a very special kinship. So what does Adorno say? This is from his book, The Authoritarian Personality, where this is the thing. After World War II, the idea was we have to make sure the Holocaust never happens again. We have to make sure these kinds of horrors never happen again. And really, the world before and after World War II, there was a distinction made where all, beautiful architecture, all these classical ideals of beauty, right, and of fine art, which has a very high standard. It's not anybody that can create fine art. It's not for everybody like we see today. Everybody's just doing whatever they feel, and it's supposed to be art. There was a very high standard. And basically he said, if we want to make sure there is no other Holocaust or any sort of terror like this, we have to eliminate these ideals. We have to eliminate these rigid standards, these dogmas, that there's something called beauty, that there's something called truth. And because we can't just enforce it or whatnot, that's why he's saying we have to intervene in the culture. We have to disabuse people from any idea that they should pursue beauty. Pursue what you like, pursue what you feel. Never mind some standard that's been established over millennia by cultures, all across the world. No, just do your own thing. So he says, what radical music perceives, and he was writing about Stravinsky, so there's the Rite of Springs and Schoenberg, so all these 20th century composers. He writes, what radical music perceives is the untransfigured suffering of man. The seismographic registration of traumatic shock becomes, at the same time, the technical, structural law of music. It forbids continuity and development. Musical language is polarized according to its extreme, towards gestures of shock, resembling bodily convulsions on the one hand, and on the other, towards a crystalline standstill of a human being whom anxiety causes to freeze in her tracks. Modern music sees absolute oblivion as its goal. It is the surviving message of despair from the shipwrecked. It is not that schizophrenia is directly expressed therein, but the music imprints upon itself an attitude similar to that of the mentally ill. The individual brings about his own disintegration. He imagines the fulfillment of the promise through magic, but nonetheless within the realm of immediate actuality. Its concern is to dominate schizophrenic traits through the aesthetic consciousness. In so doing, it would hope to vindicate insanity as true health. So, that's what radical new music that's going to kind of break us out of any standard, any sort of preconceived notion, right? What's normal, right? If you ask people what's normal today, oh, well, there's no normal, right? Anything goes, really. So it's really this idea. It seems kind of crazy, but no, if you go down that road, then yeah, you have to get rid of any idea of normal. You have to get rid of any standard of truth. You have to destroy society, right? You have to destroy the minds of people so that they can't conceive basically of universals. The idea is we must destroy universals. There cannot be any universal. How will society function? God knows. But
Can't use the word God.
sorry, I didn't use a trigger warning. I apologize. But we can see how what he says here, Theodore Adorno, we can see how then the distorted, this popular image of Poe, right, this perversion of one of the most sublime literary figures in history, how it sort of fits, right? He says it brings about one's own disintegration. It is the surviving message of despair from the shipwrecked. A lot of Poe's works, at a superficial level, could be interpreted in certain ways, but only if you read things at a superficial level, and you don't actually see the paradoxes, and you don't face what he's actually challenging you to face, like Christine showed with the Imp of the Perverse. So, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to present a few poems, and we're going to look at them and talk about them, because Poe wrote quite a bit articulating these ideas of composition, that beauty is something intelligible, that beauty is something that is knowable, that we can create and discover and understand and experience. It's something universal. And so there's a way to get at it. So I'm going to read 3 poems, and they're going to get increasingly more dense, and it's going to go from more popular to least popular. So I'm going to start with The Raven, which I've been trying to memorize for the last 2 days. I kept telling myself way back, I should just memorize this thing, and finally I changed my whole presentation last minute, and so I'm trying to memorize it. So, and then we're going to talk about what he says. Just need a drink of water. The Raven, by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, rapping at my chamber door. Only this and nothing more. Distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my book surcease of sorrow. Sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, or "Madam, truly your forgiveness I implore, but the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, And so faintly you came tapping, tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door, darkness there and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word Lenore. This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, Lenore. Merely this and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. Surely, said I, that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind and nothing more. Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven from the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not an instant stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven, wandering the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Much I marveled, this ungainly fowl, to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door with such name as Nevermore. But the raven sitting lonely on the placid bust spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before. By the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, nevermore. Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master who unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore of never, nevermore. But the raven, still beguiling all my sad soul into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushion seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to this fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated over, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating over, she shall press, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfume from some unseen censer swung by angels whose faint footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by the angels he hath sent thee respite, respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, forget thy lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still if bird or devil, whether tempter sent or tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted. Tell me truly, I implore, tell me, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aidenn it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart. Quit thy bust from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a dreamin' that is dreaming. And the lamplight over him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. Good. Until I get it full, it's still gonna, be a bit. But this poem took the world by storm. When people read this, this made it to Europe. The French loved it. People that it's English poetry, but it became universal. And the question is, why was it universally regarded? What was it about this poem? Because Poe intended to write it. He knew it would have the effect that it did. He said, I wanted to write something that would appeal both to the popular taste and the critical taste. So in his philosophy of composition, he goes about, I should have had it displayed, but he goes about talking about how he crafted the raven, how he went about it. And he starts by saying, I had to think of a length. I want to have a certain kind of effect. I need a certain length to make sure this thing gets felt properly. And then he talks about tone. What kind of tone? What kind of sentiment do I want to induce that is conducive to the poetic mood? So how do I create the most poetic of moods? And so here's something he says that I think is pretty interesting. He says, I ask myself, of all melancholy topics, what according to the universal understanding of mankind is the most melancholy? Right, he said sadness was the emotion that was most conducive to the poetic sentiment, which is interesting. Why is that? Why is sadness something that evokes the poetic? So he says, death was the obvious reply in terms of the saddest thing. And when I said, is this most melancholy of topics most poetical? From what I have already explained at some length, the answer here is also obvious. When it most closely allies itself to beauty. The death, then, of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world, and equally, it is beyond doubt that the lips best suited for such topic are those of a bereaved lover. So this is interesting, and especially today in the modern aesthetic, and they say, yeah, that's just one way and whatever, sure. And he's not putting forward a formula here, but he's saying that he said at the beginning, there's this innate thirst for immortality inside every human being, and some are more conscious of it than others. And so poetry, great art, is kindling this. So if you want to awake this yearning, you have to find the subjects and the kind of ideas that will evoke it. Otherwise, you get art today, right? Which is very much what Adorno talks about, right? When he says it forbids continuity and development, right? Art today is because there's no principle, right? Because we had to get rid of any standard of beauty, we had to get rid of any standard of truth, right? There's nothing really, the art doesn't really have much content. It's just about feelings, it's just perceptions. And it becomes a mirror of an increasingly ugly society, because art is just supposed to be, in this sense, we're just supposed to express how things are, right? The reality is disgusting, and we're going to portray that. So you get stuck, right? But it's also not true, because it denies the fact that there is this innate yearning for immortality in each human being. And the real question is, how do you unfold that? How do you kindle this in every child? Or it's there in every child. How do you develop it in every child? And so poetry has a great power to kindle exactly these kind of sublime sentiments that people are just not going to experience otherwise. So now I'm going to read a different Poe poem, a less popular Poe poem, and we're just going to look at it, and we're going to keep doing that till we get to the most dense and most rigorously composed, let's say. So this is For Annie. I wanted to put it up so people... So this is For Annie by Edgar Allan Poe. Thank heaven the crisis, the danger is past, and the lingering illness is over at last, and the fever called living is conquered at last. Sadly, I know I am shorn of my strength, at no muscle I move as I lie at full length, but no matter, I feel I am better at length. And I rest so composedly now in my bed, that any beholder might fancy me dead, might start at beholding me, thinking me dead. The moaning and groaning, the sighing and sobbing are quieted now, with that horrible throbbing at heart. Ah, that horrible, horrible throbbing. The sickness, the nausea, the pitiless pain have ceased with the fever that maddened my brain, with the fever called living that burned in my brain. And of all tortures, that torture the worst has abated, that terrible torture of thirst for the naphthaline river of passion accursed. I have drank of a water that quenches all thirst, of a water that flows with a lullaby sound from a spring but a very few feet underground, from a cavern not very far down underground. And let it never be foolishly said that my room it is gloomy and narrow my bed, for man never slept in a different bed, and to sleep you must slumber in just such a bed. My tantalized spirit here blandly reposes, forgetting or never regretting its roses, its old agitations of myrtles and roses. For now, while so quietly lying, it fancies a holier odor about it of pansies, a rosemary odor commingled with pansies, with rue and the beautiful Puritan pansies. And so it lies happily, bathing in many a dream and the truth of the beauty of Annie, drowned in a bath of the tresses of Annie. She tenderly kissed me, she fondly caressed, and then I fell gently to sleep on her breast, deeply to sleep from the heaven of her breast. When the light was extinguished, she covered me warm, and she prayed to the angels to keep me from harm, to the Queen of the angels to shield me from harm. And I lie so composedly now in my bed, knowing her love, that you fancy me dead. And I rest so contentedly now in my bed, with her love at my breast, that you fancy me dead. That you shudder to look at me, thinking me dead. But my heart it is brighter than all of the stars in the sky, for it sparkles with Annie. It glows with the light of the love of my Annie, with the thought of the light of the eyes of my Annie. Okay. I just want to ask, what, because Poe is talking about the effect, so I don't want something specific here. What is the, if people had to name one sentiment that they felt when hearing this poem? Like, it can be confusion, it could be a mixed emotion. But is there some sort of feeling that people feel they would articulate when they there's no right answer here. It's because I'll tell you what I think. It's strange.
Feeling, yeah.
Yes, mixed, yeah.
It's a bit dark, it's a bit hopeful at the same time.
Yeah, no, I thought, I always wondered about this poem for a long time, and it's only recently that I started to think like, okay, I have a sense of how to try and approach this poem. Because yes, it sounds very morbid. It's very, there's a sort of morbidity to everything he's saying, especially when you just read it. But when you think about reciting it aloud, there's an excitement, there's a joy, there's an energy, which is strange because it sounds very morbid, right? But so this is the thing about poetry as well, is that the way things appear and the way they actually are often two completely different things. And what Poe is doing, what the great poet does, is truth or an idea is never communicated literally in great art, right? It's always indirectly. It's usually they compel you with some great paradox that challenges you to conceive of what your senses cannot, what the surface interpretation of things will not allow you to understand. And so you have to go deeper. And all great art does this. So there's a similar, Keats in his famous Ode to a Nightingale. This is how I started to figure out this poem in my head. Keats in his Ode to a Nightingale, very famous piece, he writes, "My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains. 1 minute passed, and lethe words had sunk. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense." But then, he says, "'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beech and green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full throated ease." It's actually very joyful, right? He says, "A drowning numbness pains my sense," but it's because he's overwhelmed with joy. There's a different kind of joy than what we're usually used to hearing, experiencing. Just like, smiley faces and, like emoticons. Like, there's no emoticon for the kind of joy and idea that, the poet's trying to communicate here. That's why we kind of have to figure it out for ourselves. So he's kind of fooling us. It sounds like it's morbid, but just to look at a few things as well, forgive me, he talks about, for example, the flowers. Right, of all tortures, that torture the worst has abated. Terrible torture of thirst, passion accursed, right? The sickness, the nausea, right? Forgive me, I'm hoarse. I've been reciting a lot over the last days. Right, we think of like this romantic idea of love, like the heart is beating and we're so ecstatic, right? The lovers are just so enthralled and, right, all the senses are basically going wild, right? There's a bit of a frenzy there. So here, right, he's saying the horrible throbbing of the heart, right? The sickness, the nausea, the love pangs, right? All these things are gone. He's freed from all these pangs, these things that attack us, these passions. And so he's talking about, when he gets to the flowers, "For now, while so quietly lying, it fancies a holier odor about it of pansies, a rosemary odor commingled with pansies." So I had to look this up, but pansies actually comes from the word, French word pensée. And pansies were like a symbol of like, you're thinking about somebody. It's not necessarily like passion or ardent, but you're thinking about somebody, you admire them, you have feelings for them. And rosemary is a rebirth, right? It's like a... So rosemary odor commingled with pansies, with rue and the beautiful Puritan pansies. And rue fits into that as well. Even in winter, you have rue where it's got some sort of like continuous quality. And so, yeah, he there are many tokens of his feelings that he's inserting here through the words. But just to say that when we read this again, my tantalized spirit here blandly reposes, right, forgetting, we're never regretting its roses, its old agitations of myrtles and roses. Back in like Elizabethan times, right, you couldn't just, start flirting with somebody, like if you liked them, like just go, hey, you want to go get a drink or something? It wasn't really like that. And so one thing that they would do is they would have bouquets of flowers. And so like if you had a rose or myrtle, these were like signs of like passion, like I'm passionate about you. And, they all have their specific meaning, but the idea is passion is kind of that romantic sort of like, fluttering, I feel like I have wings. So all that has left him. And so he is so overwhelmed by joy, right? All these other senses have basically faded, such that when you are at such peace, you're so happy. There's this expression, you're so happy, like you could die. You would be happy dying, just you're at complete peace. And so what is the closest metaphor for like absolute peace? It really becomes death. Death becomes the ultimate peace. And so in order to communicate the quality of love and of joy that he's really experiencing, there really is no other sentiment. There is really no better metaphor than death. So this piece is really something, the way he does it. And he wrote a letter. He wrote this at the end of his life. Annie was somebody he had feelings for, but they were married, and it remained like a platonic thing, which I think speaks to the kind of idea. He loves this person, but he's actually content with just being friends with her. He loves her so much that just, being her friend and all that, he's completely at peace with that. And so there's many ways to look at this, but the rhythm really gives you a sense. It's very excited, it's very joyful, so it goes against what it seems to say literally. So lastly, I'll end with Poe's El Dorado, which is another poem that he wrote in the last year of his life. And it's very short. So yeah, I'm just going to read it. This is just so we can look at it after. So El Dorado. Gaily bedight, a gallant knight, in sunshine and in shadow, had journeyed long, singing a song in search of El Dorado. But he grew old, this knight so bold, and over his heart a shadow fell as he found no spot of ground that looked like El Dorado. And as his strength failed him at length, he met a pilgrim shadow. Shadow, said he, where can it be, this land of El Dorado? Over the mountains of the moon, down the valley of the shadow, ride, boldly ride, the shade replied, if you seek for El Dorado. Very short. So what's going on here, though? There's many things to look at. There's a refrain. There's a refrain. Well, most of Poe's pieces have a refrain, not all. But, yeah, let's look at this one. So, Gailey, do people notice anything? I don't want to make it too interactive, but if somebody notices, what's being repeated here? There's several things being repeated. What's being repeated? Where? Shadow. Yeah. In each stanza, shadow is repeated. And then there's El Dorado. Okay. So if we go through this, in sunshine and in shadow, what kind of shadow is this? This is just a literal shadow, right? It's normal shadow, cast by any mortal. And o'er his heart a shadow. Is that the same kind of shadow? How can you have a shadow on your heart? So we're only into, not even 12 lines, short, just a few words, never mind 12 lines, it's like less than 20 words. But there's this metaphorical meaning that's getting introduced already. But it's just the second stanza. And as his strength failed him at length, he met a pilgrim shadow. A pilgrim shadow. What is that? I've never met a pilgrim shadow. Shadow, said he, where can it be, this land of El Dorado? Okay, now shadow comes back one more time. Down the valley of the shadow. Is that a thing? Is that a thing? Is the valley of shadows a thing? It's actually, there's a reference in the Bible. There's a prayer. I don't remember the specific reference, but though I walk through the valley of the shadow, I fear no evil.
Shadow of death. Shadow of the valley of death.
Well, I've looked that up. There's several translations as well, depending on which Bible you're using. But yeah, the valley of the shadow, that's a thing, per se. So, okay, so that's shadow. Something's happening with this word shadow. Now, El Dorado. What's the knight looking for? The lost city of gold. Okay. He grew old. He's been looking for this lost city of gold because then he'll truly be happy, right? He'll just have a lot of gold and that's going to get him everything he needs. And as his strength failed him at length, right? If only I can find this city of gold. He meets a pilgrim shadow. Where can it be, this land of El Dorado? And what does the shadow say? Over the mountains of the moon, down the valley of the shadow. First off, where is that? Is that a literal place? How do I get there? Can I get directions from security here at the university? Or the shade replied, if you seek for El Dorado. Is the El Dorado that the shade speaks of the same El Dorado that the knight's looking for? So there's a lot going on here in 4 little stanzas with so few words. And this is what great art does, right? It's challenging you to capture a higher idea of truth that you can't through your senses. That the truth is not told to you. Your mind is compelled to make a discovery. And so we see that Poe, despite this popular image of this self-destructive, macabre figure, before Poe died, in a sense, he found this El Dorado, right? He pursued it, as we see with all the quotes and what he wrote about, in beauty, right? In that which doesn't change, right? In this unwavering effort to create, promote, and develop beauty. So, let's see what he says. Let's finish with a... Okay, we're just going to read like that. While conscience teaches the obligation and reason the expediency, taste contents herself with displaying the charms, waging war upon vice solely on the ground of her deformity, her disproportion, her animosity to the fitting, to the appropriate, to the harmonious, in a word, to beauty. And so, this is what I was saying at the beginning, that Poe, like all great artists, understood that unless people, the population, is able to experience beauty, right, in great art, they'll never be able to pursue it in the real world. So art is uniquely the thing that will allow human beings, especially in a time of crisis where there is no reference point necessarily for what is better or what should be, through art they can discover this. And then they're free. So I'll leave it at that.